The heavy oak door swung open with a groan that seemed to come from the house's very bones, and Margaret Whitmore stepped across the threshold, her infant son Thomas wailing against her chest. The cold November wind followed them inside, carrying the scent of dying leaves and something else, something sweet and rotten that made her stomach turn. Behind her, the door slammed shut with such force that the sound echoed through the empty hallways like a gunshot. "Welcome home," Edmund said, setting down their single trunk with a hollow thud that seemed to disappear into the walls. His voice carried a forced cheerfulness that fooled neither of them. Thomas's cries grew sharper, more desperate, as if the house itself was pressing down on his tiny lungs. Margaret's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and she felt her breath catch. The wallpaper was a deep burgundy that might have once been elegant, but now dark stains spread across it like spilled wine or dried blood. The stains seemed to pulse in her peripheral vision, growing and shrinking with each beat of her heart. Along the hallway, oil paintings of children stared down at her, pale, hollow-eyed children in clothes from different eras, their small hands folded in their laps, their mouths set in lines too serious for their young faces. "Edmund," she whispered, shifting Thomas to her other arm. "These children, they look so sad." Her husband moved beside her, his footsteps causing the floorboards to sigh and creak beneath his weight. The sounds weren't like normal settling, they were too rhythmic, too much like breathing. "They're just old portraits, Margaret. The Lowen family has lived here for generations." "Has lived?" she asked, studying a particularly haunting portrait of a boy who couldn't have been more than 4, his dark eyes seeming to track her movement. "Where are they now?" Edmund's jaw tightened, and he avoided her gaze. "Dead. All of them. The last of the family died out 20 years ago." He paused, then added quietly, "That's why the rent is so reasonable." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air seeping through the windows. Thomas had stopped crying, but his silence was somehow worse. He stared up at the painted children with wide, unblinking eyes, as if he could see something she couldn't. "How did they die?" "Margaret, we've been through this. We need this house. The factory job pays well, but we can't afford anywhere else in town." Edmund's voice carried a note of desperation she'd heard too often in recent months. Since the war ended and he'd returned from Virginia, work had been scarce, and they'd moved from boarding house to boarding house, always behind on rent, always one step ahead of destitution. "You haven't answered my question." Edmund sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The children. None of them lived past their second winter. Illness, mostly. Sometimes accidents." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "But that was different times, Margaret. Medicine wasn't what it is now. Children died young everywhere." "All of them?" Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas stirred in her arms, making soft mewling sounds that seemed to echo strangely in the hallway. "The family was cursed, according to the townspeople." "Nonsense, of course. Old wives' tales and superstition." But Edmund's voice lacked conviction, and Margaret noticed how his eyes kept darting to the portraits, as if expecting them to move. Margaret walked deeper into the house, her skirts rustling against the worn wooden floors. The hallway stretched before them, longer than it had appeared from the outside, lined with doors that stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of shadowed rooms beyond. The air grew colder with each step, and she could swear she heard something, a whisper, perhaps, or the sound of small feet running on floors above. "The nursery is upstairs," Edmund said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "I've already moved the cradle in." They climbed the narrow staircase, each step producing a different note, as if the house were a vast musical instrument being played by their movement. The banister was smooth under Margaret's free hand, worn by countless palms over the decades. At the top of the stairs, a single window let in the gray afternoon light, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The nursery door stood open, and Margaret paused at the threshold. The room was small but well appointed, with pale yellow wallpaper decorated with tiny flowers. A wooden cradle sat beneath the window, and she could see that Edmund had already arranged their few baby clothes in the small dresser. But something felt wrong about the space. It was too cold, too still, as if the air itself were holding its breath. "It's lovely," she lied, stepping inside. Thomas began to fuss again, his small fists waving in the air. Margaret approached the window and gasped. Carved into the wooden sill were dozens of initials, small and careful, the work of children's hands. JL 1798. ML 1823. SL 1844. The list went on and on, each set of initials followed by dates that spanned decades. Some were barely legible, worn smooth by time and weather. "Edmund, look at this." He joined her at the window, his face growing pale as he read the carvings. "Lowen children," he said quietly. They must have liked to play by the window. But why are there so many? And look at the dates, some of these go back 70 years. Margaret traced one set of initials with her finger, and the wood felt strangely warm, as if recently touched by living hands. From somewhere in the walls came a sound that made them both freeze, the soft, distant sound of children laughing. It was muffled, as if coming from far away, but unmistakably real. Thomas stopped crying entirely, his head turning toward the sound with an alertness that seemed impossible for a 6-month-old infant. "Did you hear that?" Margaret whispered. Edmund's face had gone ashen. "It's just the wind in the eaves. Old houses make strange sounds." But even as he spoke, the laughter came again, closer this time, seeming to move through the walls themselves. It was the sound of children at play, innocent and joyful, but there was something underneath it, something hungry and desperate that made Margaret's skin crawl. "We should leave," she said suddenly, backing away from the window. "Edmund, please. We should leave now. We can't." His voice was flat, defeated. "Margaret, you know we can't. We have nowhere else to go, and winter's coming. At least here, Thomas will be warm." Margaret looked down at her son, who was staring at the ceiling with those unnaturally alert eyes, and felt a terror so deep it seemed to reach into her bones. The house watched them, she was certain of it now. The walls breathed around them, the floorboards sighed their secrets, and somewhere in the dark spaces between the visible world and whatever lay beyond, children who had died too young whispered their warnings to anyone who would listen. But Edmund was right. They had nowhere else to go. Winter was coming to North Carolina's mountains, and they had a baby to keep alive. Even if staying in this house felt like feeding Thomas to some invisible, patient beast, the alternative was freezing to death on the road. "Just until spring," she said, more to herself than to Edmund. "We'll find somewhere else in the spring." The laughter in the walls had stopped, but Margaret could swear she felt the house settling around them like a great creature getting comfortable. Whatever lived here had been waiting, and now it had what it wanted, another family, another child to add to its collection. As night fell and they unpacked their meager belongings, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed more than just a threshold when they entered the Lowen house. They had stepped into something ancient and hungry, something that had been fed by generations of children's lives, and now it was her turn to decide whether Thomas would survive his second winter, or join the ranks of the pale, serious children whose portraits lined the hallway below. Have you ever walked into a place that felt like it was watching you? Tell me about it in the comments. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret first carried Thomas across the threshold of the Lowen house, and the nightmares had begun on the very first night. She would find herself standing in the nursery in the depths of sleep, but it wasn't the nursery as she knew it. The wallpaper was different, older, and the cradle held not Thomas but other children, children she had never seen but somehow knew by name. Their mothers stood in the shadows, women in clothes from different eras, their faces drawn with grief and their eyes hollow with a knowledge that Margaret was only beginning to understand. "You have to leave," whispered a woman in a high-necked dress from decades past, her hair pinned severely back, her hands clasped before her as if in prayer. "Before the cold sets in. Before it's too late." "Who are you?" Margaret asked in the dream, but she already knew the answer. "Catherine Lowen. My son William was the first." The woman's voice carried the weight of decades of sorrow. "I thought I could protect him. I thought love would be enough." Margaret would wake from these dreams with Thomas crying in her arms, his small body cold despite the heavy quilts she wrapped around him. Edmund slept through it all, his breathing deep and even, as if the house held no terrors for him. During the day, he worked at the textile mill in town, leaving Margaret alone with Thomas and the growing certainty that they were not alone in the house. It was during one of Thomas's afternoon naps that Margaret made her discovery. She had been searching for additional blankets in the kitchen, opening cabinets and drawers with the desperate efficiency of a mother trying to keep her child warm. Behind the pantry, hidden by a loose board that moved at her touch, she found a narrow door that she was certain hadn't been there the day before. The door opened onto a small room, windowless and cold, that seemed to exist in the space between the kitchen and the back wall of the house. Margaret's breath came out in visible puffs as she stepped inside, and what she saw there made her legs weak with terror. The room was filled with children's belongings, arranged with meticulous care as if their owners had simply stepped out for a moment. Wooden toys painted in faded primary colors sat on shelves alongside rag dolls with button eyes and yarn hair. Tiny shoes, some no bigger than her palm, were lined up against one wall in neat pairs. Dresses and little suits hung from pegs, sized for children who would never grow into them. Each item bore a small paper tag tied with string, and Margaret's hands shook as she read them. William Lowen, age 2. Died December 1823. Mary Lowen, age 18 months. Died January 1844. Samuel Lowen, age 2. Died February 1857. The tags went on and on, a catalogue of young lives cut short, a museum of childhood ended before it could truly begin. In the center of the room sat a rocking chair, its wood worn smooth by countless hours of use. On the seat lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it, recognizing the careful feminine script on the first page. The Journal of Catherine Lowen, begun in the year of our Lord 1823. Margaret sank into the rocking chair and began to read, her heart pounding as Catherine's words revealed truths that Edmund had either not known or not shared. The Lowen family had built their house on land that the Cherokee had warned them never to disturb, land where something ancient and hungry had slept beneath the roots of an old-growth forest. Jeremiah Lowen, Catherine's husband, had been a proud man who refused to listen to what he called savage superstitions. The first winter was mild, Catherine had written. Jeremiah said it was Providence smiling on our new home. But when William began to sicken in December, I started to understand that Providence had nothing to do with our good fortune. Something else was keeping us warm, something that demanded payment for its generosity. Margaret read on, her horror growing with each page. Catherine described the same dreams that had been plaguing Margaret, the voices of mothers who had lost children, the sense of being watched, the way the house seemed to breathe around them. But Catherine's entries grew increasingly desperate as winter deepened and young William grew weaker. December 15, 1823. William will not eat. He stares at the walls as if he sees something I cannot, and when I hold him, his skin is cold as winter air. Jeremiah insists it is merely the croup, but I know better now. I have seen the other mothers in my dreams. They have told me what lives beneath our house, what feeds on the warmth of children's blood to keep the winter at bay. Margaret's hands shook as she turned the page, but she had to keep reading. December 20, 1823. I tried to leave today. packed what I could carry and bundled William in every blanket we own. But the front door would not open, though it is not locked. The windows will not break, though I threw a chair at them with all my strength. We are trapped here, William and I can feel the thing beneath the house growing stronger as my son grows weaker. It feeds on children's life force, their pure energy, and in return it keeps the cold from our bones. But the price, oh Lord, the price is too high. Margaret turned to the final entry, written in handwriting that was increasingly erratic, as if Catherine's hand had been shaking as badly as Margaret's was now. December 23, 1823. William is dying. I can see it in his eyes, the way they look through me to something I pray I never see. The thing beneath our house is hungry, so hungry, and it has been patient long enough. I tried to give it my own life instead, but it will not take what it does not want. It wants innocence. It wants the untainted energy of childhood. I am writing this in my own blood because the ink has frozen in the well. If anyone finds this journal, if anyone comes to live in this cursed place, know that you cannot save your children. You can only choose how quickly you lose them. The journal ended there, but the final page was stained with something dark and rust-colored that Margaret knew with horrible certainty was blood. She closed the book with trembling hands, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. From upstairs came the sound of Thomas crying, but there was something different about it, weaker, more plaintive, like a sound coming from very far away. Margaret ran from the hidden room, through the kitchen, up the stairs to the nursery, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thomas lay in his cradle, but he looked, diminished somehow, as if some essential part of him was slowly draining away. His cries were weaker than they had been that morning, his skin paler, his eyes unfocused in a way that reminded her horribly of Catherine's description of young William. "No," Margaret whispered, lifting her son and pressing him against her chest. "No, you can't have him. I won't let you have him." But even as she spoke, she could feel the house listening, patient and implacable. Whatever lived beneath the Lowen House had been feeding on children for over 70 years, and it would not be denied by one desperate mother's love. Margaret rocked Thomas in her arms, singing soft lullabies that seemed to disappear into the walls around them, swallowed by something vast and hungry that had all the time in the world to wait. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, and Margaret knew with terrible certainty that her son was running out of time. The town records office smelled of dust and old paper, a mustiness that seemed to cling to Margaret's clothes long after she left. She had taken Thomas with her on the 2-mile walk into town, despite Edmund's protests that the cold November air would be bad for the baby's lungs. What she hadn't told her husband was that the house had begun to feel more dangerous than any winter wind. Mrs. Hawthorne, the records keeper, was a thin woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of Margaret's appearance. She had lived in the town her entire life, and her grandmother had been alive when the Lowen House was first built. "You're living in that place," Mrs. Hawthorne said, not a question but a statement heavy with disapproval. "With a baby. My husband found work at the mill. We needed somewhere to live." Margaret shifted Thomas in her arms, noting how his breathing had become shallower over the past few days, how his small chest barely rose and fell beneath the layers of blankets. "Fools," Mrs. Hawthorne muttered, but she led Margaret to the back of the office where leather-bound ledgers held the town's history. "What is it you want to know?" "The Lowen family. How they died. All of them." Mrs. Hawthorne pulled a ledger from 1798 and opened it with reverent care. The pages were filled with careful handwriting documenting births, deaths, marriages, and property transfers. Jeremiah Lowen came here from Virginia in 1798. Bought 300 acres of forest land from the state, though the Cherokee warned him it was cursed ground. Built his house right on top of what they called a hungry place. Margaret leaned forward, studying the records. What did they mean by that? The Cherokee said something lived in the old-growth forest, something that had been sleeping under the roots for longer than human memory. They made offerings to keep it asleep, but Jeremiah, he cleared the land, burned the trees, built his house right over where the Cherokee said the heart of the thing was buried. The records painted a picture of a family blessed with unusual prosperity at first. Jeremiah's crops never failed, his livestock never sickened, his house stayed warm even in the harshest winters without consuming the amounts of firewood his neighbors required. But the price for this good fortune became clear within a few years. William Lowen, first son, died December 23, 1823, aged 2 years. Cause of death, fever and wasting sickness. Mrs. Hawthorne's finger traced the entry. Mary Lowen, first daughter, died January 15, 1844, age 18 months. Cause of death, sudden illness. Samuel Lowen, second son, died February 3, 1857, age 2 years. The list goes on. Margaret's blood ran cold as she read entry after entry. Every child born to the Lowen family had died before their second winter, all from similar symptoms: wasting sickness, sudden weakness, a gradual fading that no doctor could explain or treat. The last entry was dated 1902, James Lowen, age 23 months. Last of the Lowen line. What happened to the parents? Margaret asked. Most of them went mad with grief. Jeremiah himself lived to be 93, but neighbors said he aged 10 years every time he lost a child. Catherine, his wife, was found dead in what they called the memory room, a place where she kept all the children's belongings. Some say she took her own life rather than watch another child die. Margaret's hands tightened around Thomas, who had grown still and quiet in her arms. And after the Lowens died out, the house stood empty for 20 years. Then families would move in, drawn by the cheap rent and the way the house stayed warm in winter. But it was always the same story: any family with children would lose them before the second winter. The few families without children who lived there reported strange things. Voices in the walls. Children's laughter at night. Toys moving on their own. Mrs. Hawthorne closed the ledger with a soft thud. My advice, young woman, is to pack your belongings and leave that place before the snows come. Find somewhere else to raise your boy. We don't have anywhere else to go. Then you'd better hope love is stronger than whatever's been feeding on children in that house for the past century. Margaret walked home through the gathering dusk, Thomas a silent weight in her arms. The Lowen house rose before them like a malevolent presence, its windows glowing with warm yellow light that should have been welcoming but instead seemed like the eyes of some great predator watching its prey return to the trap. Edmund was waiting in the kitchen, pacing the worn floorboards with the nervous energy of a man who had spent the day alone with his fears. Where have you been? I was worried sick. Researching our new home. Margaret set Thomas in his basket and began preparing dinner with mechanical movements, her mind racing with everything she had learned. Margaret, you can't keep dwelling on old stories and superstitions. The past is the past. Is it? She turned to face him, noting how he avoided her eyes. Edmund, how long did you know about the children? How long have you known what this house does to families? His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked older than his 32 years. The mill foreman told me the first day. Said I was brave or stupid for taking the place with a baby. And you didn't think to tell me? What was I supposed to do, Margaret? Let us freeze in the street? At least here Thomas has a chance. Does he? Margaret's voice rose to nearly a shout. Look at him, Edmund. Really look at him. They both turned to the basket where Thomas lay, and Margaret's heart clenched with fear. In the 3 weeks since they had moved into the house, their son had changed in ways that couldn't be explained by normal growth. His skin had taken on a translucent quality, as if he were slowly fading from the inside out. His cries had grown weaker, his movements less vigorous, his bright blue eyes increasingly unfocused. Edmund knelt beside the basket, his hand hovering over Thomas's chest. "He's just adjusting to the new environment. Babies are sensitive." But Margaret could see the fear in her husband's eyes, could hear the desperate hope in his voice. She wanted to believe him, wanted to convince herself that the changes in Thomas were normal, explainable, temporary. Instead, she found herself remembering Catherine Lowen's journal, the way she had described young William's gradual fading, the sense that something was slowly draining the life from him. After Edmund went to bed, Margaret crept down to the kitchen with a lantern and pried open the hidden door behind the pantry. The room of lost children's belongings felt colder than before, but she forced herself to search through the collection until she found what she was looking for, a small wooden box tucked behind a collection of dolls. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, written by parents who had lived in the house over the decades. All told the same story: children who grew weaker with each passing day, parents who felt helpless against an enemy they couldn't see or fight, families torn apart by a curse that seemed to hunger specifically for young life. At the bottom of the box, Margaret found a letter written in handwriting she recognized from the journal, Catherine Lowen's desperate script, but this was addressed to "the mother who comes after." "If you are reading this, then you have found what I could not, a way into the room where I have kept vigil over my lost children. I pray that you are wiser than I was, stronger than I was, brave enough to do what I could not. The thing that lives beneath our house is ancient and patient. It feeds slowly, drawing the life from children over weeks and months, savoring their energy like fine wine. But it can be fought. The Cherokee knew how. They made offerings, kept it sleeping with ritual and respect. But they also knew how to kill it, if killing is even the right word for something that was never truly alive." Margaret's hands shook as she read on. "In the deepest part of the basement, where the foundation meets the earth, you will find where its roots have grown strongest. The thing appears as a network of living wood, pulsing with stolen life, centered around what the Cherokee called a heart tree. If you can sever the connection between the heart and the house, you can free the children's spirits and stop it from taking any more. But the cost may be everything you have to give." The letter ended there, but tucked beneath it was a crude map of the house's basement, showing passages and rooms that Margaret was certain didn't exist. Or at least, didn't exist in the same way as the rest of the house. As she climbed the stairs back to the nursery, Margaret could swear she heard the house breathing around her, the walls expanding and contracting like lungs, the floorboards creaking in rhythm with some vast, slow heartbeat. Thomas lay in his cradle, so still that for a moment Margaret feared the worst, but when she placed her hand on his chest she could feel the faint flutter of his pulse, weaker than it should be but still there. "I'm going to save you," she whispered to her son. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I'm going to save you." But even as she made the promise, Margaret could feel the house listening, and she sensed that whatever lived beneath their home was no longer content to wait. Winter was coming to North Carolina's mountains, and the thing that had been feeding on children for over a century was growing hungry again. Margaret waited until the deep hours of night, when Edmund's breathing had settled into the heavy rhythm of exhausted sleep, before she crept down to the kitchen carrying the ritual instructions she had found in Catherine Lowen's hidden letters. The house felt different in the darkness, more alive, more aware, as if the absence of daylight allowed its true nature to emerge. The ritual was simple but terrifying in its implications. Catherine had discovered that the mothers who had lost children to the house remained bound to it, their spirits unable to rest while the thing beneath continued to feed. By offering her own blood and speaking their names, Margaret could call them forth and learn what they knew about fighting the entity that had claimed their children. Margaret arranged the items Catherine had described: a bowl of water from the well behind the house, a knife sharp enough to draw blood, and candles made from tallow that had been stored in the hidden room for decades. The candles burned with a strange, greenish flame that cast writhing shadows on the kitchen walls. "Catherine Lowen," Margaret whispered, pricking her finger with the knife and letting 3 drops of blood fall into the water. Mother of William, lost to the hunger in 1823. The water began to cloud, swirling with colors that had no name, and the temperature in the kitchen dropped so suddenly that Margaret's breath came out in visible puffs. Margaret Lowen, she continued, reading from Catherine's list. Mother of Mary, lost in 1844. More blood, more names, more mothers called from whatever realm held spirits too tormented to find peace. With each name, the air grew colder and the shadows deeper, until Margaret felt as if she were standing at the bottom of a great well, looking up at a circle of light that grew smaller with each passing moment. Sarah Whitfield, she whispered, her voice shaking as she read the final name on Catherine's list. Mother of James, lost in 1902. Last of the Lowen line. The blood in the water began to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light, and Margaret heard a sound like wind moving through dead leaves. The shadows on the walls deepened and took shape, and suddenly she was no longer alone in the kitchen. They stood around her in a circle, the mothers who had lost children to the house's hunger, women from different eras, their clothes spanning a century of fashion, their faces united by a grief so profound it had transcended death itself. Catherine Lowen stood directly across from Margaret, her high-necked dress and severe hairstyle making her appear like a Victorian mourning portrait come to life. You called us, Catherine said, her voice carrying the sound of autumn wind through empty branches. You seek to know what we know, to learn what we learned too late. I want to save my son, Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Tell me how to fight it. Child, said another woman, this one in a dress from the 1870s, her dark hair streaked with premature gray. Do you think we didn't try to save our children? Do you think we were weak, that we simply allowed our babies to fade away? Margaret's throat tightened. I didn't mean. We fought, interrupted a third woman, younger than the others, wearing the simple dress of a mill worker's wife. We raged and screamed and offered our own lives in place of our children's. But the thing beneath this house is older than human love, older than human will. It has been patient for centuries, and it will not be denied by one desperate mother. Catherine stepped forward, her ghostly form seeming more solid than the others. But we have learned things in our years of watching, of being bound to this place by our grief and fury. The entity is not invulnerable. It can be hurt, perhaps even destroyed, but the cost. Tell me, Margaret said. Whatever the cost. The assembled mothers exchanged glances that spoke of shared knowledge and shared pain. Catherine spoke again, her words carrying the weight of decades of futile planning. The thing that feeds on your son is not a single creature but a network, roots and tendrils that spread beneath the entire house, drawing power from the earth itself and from the life force of every child who has died here. At its center, in the deepest part of the basement, grows what the Cherokee called the heart tree, a mass of living wood that pulses with stolen life. Margaret felt her hands clench into fists. How do I destroy it? You cannot destroy it with any earthly weapon, said the woman in the mill worker's dress. But you can sever its connection to this world, send it back to whatever dark realm spawned it. The ritual requires three things: the willing sacrifice of a mother's love, the blood of the last child it seeks to claim, and the destruction of every physical anchor that binds it to our world. What does that mean? Margaret asked, though part of her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. Catherine's expression grew infinitely sad. It means you must choose, child. You can save your son, but only by ensuring that no other children ever live in this house. You must burn it to the ground while performing the ritual, trapping yourself and the entity together in the flames. Your sacrifice will sever its connection to the physical world, but you will not survive to raise the child you save. Margaret's legs felt weak, and she gripped the edge of the kitchen table for support. There has to be another way. We have had over a century to find another way, said another mother, her voice heavy with decades of searching. This is the only path that leads to victory, and even then, success is not guaranteed. The entity will fight back with everything it has accumulated over the decades. It will try to turn your husband against you, to make you doubt your own sanity, to convince you that submission is preferable to the pain of fighting. And your son. Catherine's voice broke with emotion. Your son will carry the scars of this place for the rest of his life. He will remember, somewhere deep in his soul, the touch of something that should not exist. But he will live. Margaret closed her eyes, thinking of Thomas sleeping upstairs, his breathing growing weaker each day, his small body slowly fading as the thing beneath their home fed on his life force. The choice Catherine presented was no choice at all, watching her son die slowly or saving him at the cost of her own life. When? She asked, opening her eyes. How long do I have? The winter solstice, Catherine replied. When the barrier between worlds is thinnest, when the entity's power reaches its peak. It will try to claim Thomas completely on that night, to drain the last of his life before the new year begins. If you're going to act, it must be then. The ghostly mothers began to fade as dawn approached, their forms becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. Catherine lingered longest, her sad eyes fixed on Margaret with something that might have been pity. We will help you when the time comes, she whispered. Our rage and grief have given us power in this place. But remember, child, once you begin the ritual, there is no turning back. The entity will know what you intend, and it will use everything it has learned about human weakness to stop you. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen as the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows. Upstairs, she could hear Thomas beginning to cry, but the sound was weaker than it had been the day before, more distant, as if he were already beginning to slip away from the world of the living. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a small betrayal of the choice she would have to make. Edmund still slept, oblivious to the conversation that had just taken place below, unaware that his wife had just agreed to sacrifice her life to save their son. Margaret lifted Thomas from his cradle, noting how light he had become, how his skin seemed almost transparent in the morning light. She held him close, memorizing the feeling of his small body against her chest, the sound of his breathing, the way his tiny fingers curled around hers. Mama's going to save you, she whispered against his soft hair. Even if she can't stay to watch you grow up. But even as she made the promise, Margaret could feel the house listening, and she knew that the hardest battle of her life was yet to come. The arguments had started 3 days ago, growing more vicious with each passing hour. Edmund had found Margaret researching fire-setting techniques in one of Catherine's hidden journals, and when she tried to explain about the ritual, about the only way to save Thomas, he had looked at her as if she had lost her mind completely. You want to burn down our home, he had shouted, his face flushed with an anger that seemed too intense for the situation. You want to murder our son in some insane ritual based on the ravings of dead women? Edmund, please, you have to listen to me. Thomas is dying. Look at him, really look at him. But when they both turned to the basket where their son lay, Margaret felt her heart stop. Thomas was so still, so pale, that for a moment she feared they were too late. Only the barely perceptible rise and fall of his chest indicated that life still flickered within his tiny frame. He's fine, Edmund said, but his voice cracked with the lie. He's just sleeping. Margaret had seen the fear in her husband's eyes, but she had also seen something else, a glazed quality that reminded her of the portraits in the hallway, as if something was looking out through Edmund's familiar features. The house was working on him, she realized, just as it had worked on the fathers who had come before. Now, on the night of the winter solstice, Margaret stood alone in the basement of the Lowen House, surrounded by the tools she would need for the ritual that would either save her son or damn them all. Above her head, she could hear Edmund pacing the floors, talking to himself in a voice that grew less familiar with each passing hour. The basement was deeper than any basement had a right to be, extending far beyond the foundation of the house above. Margaret's lantern cast dancing shadows on walls that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and the air was thick with the smell of rich earth and something else, something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. Following Catherine's map, Margaret had found the passage that led to the deepest part of the basement, where the foundation stones gave way to raw earth and exposed roots. The passage was narrow, forcing her to crawl on her hands and knees, and with each foot she traveled deeper into the earth, the temperature dropped and the sense of ancient presence grew stronger. At the end of the passage, the space opened into a natural cavern that predated the house by centuries. And there, in the center of the cavern, Margaret found the heart of the thing that had been feeding on children for over 100 years. It was not a tree in any conventional sense, but rather a massive tangle of roots and woody flesh that pulsed with a rhythm like a gigantic heart. The thing rose from the floor of the cavern to disappear into the ceiling above, and Margaret realized with horror that its tendrils probably extended throughout the entire house, reaching into every room, every corner, every space where children had lived and died. The heart tree was covered in a network of smaller roots that glowed with a sickly phosphorescent light, and as Margaret watched, she could see pulses of energy flowing through them like blood through veins. With each pulse, she felt a corresponding weakness in her own body, and she knew that somewhere above, Thomas was growing weaker still. "You have come at last," a voice said behind her, and Margaret spun around to see Edmund standing in the mouth of the passage. But it was not her Edmund. This version of her husband moved with an alien grace, and his eyes held depths that seemed to go on forever. "Edmund," she whispered, backing away toward the heart tree. "Fight it. I know you're still in there." "Your husband sleeps," the thing wearing Edmund's face replied, its voice a horrible parody of the man she had married. "As his fathers slept before him. As all the fathers sleep when the time comes to feed. Did you think you were the first mother to discover our little arrangement? Did you think you were the first to believe she could fight what has stood for centuries?" Margaret's hand closed around the knife she had brought, the same blade Catherine had used in her ritual so many decades ago. "You can't have him. You can't have Thomas." "We already have him," Edmund's stolen voice replied with amusement. "Feel how weak he has become, how little life remains in his small body. In a few hours, when the solstice reaches its peak, we will draw the last of his essence into ourselves, and he will join the other children who have fed our growth over the decades." "The mothers told me how to stop you," Margaret said, raising the knife. "They told me about the ritual." The thing laughed with Edmund's voice, but the sound was wrong, too deep, too resonant for human vocal cords. "The mothers told you how to die heroically while accomplishing nothing. Do you think we would allow a weakness to exist in our defenses for over a century without addressing it? The ritual they described will indeed sever our connection to this world, and take your son with us when we go." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice. "You're lying." "Are we?" "Think, foolish woman. What binds your son to us? What has been feeding on his life force since the day you entered this house? The connection between us runs deeper than blood now, it runs through his very soul. If you destroy us, you destroy the part of him that we have claimed. He will die regardless." The knife trembled in Margaret's hand as the horrible logic of the entity's words sank in. Had the ghostly mothers lied to her, or had they simply not known the full truth? Had she spent weeks preparing for a ritual that would kill Thomas just as surely as doing nothing? "But there is another way," Edmund's voice continued, silky and persuasive. "Join with us willingly. Offer yourself as you intended, but not in destruction, in union. Become part of our network, help us spread beyond this single house, and your son will live. Not as he was, perhaps, but as something greater. Something that will never know hunger or cold or pain." Margaret looked at the heart tree, seeing now that what she had taken for wood was something else entirely, something that might once have been human, transformed and absorbed into the entity's mass. She could see faces in the twisted flesh, the features of mothers who had made the choice the thing was offering her now. "You're asking me to become a monster," she whispered. "We are offering you immortality. We are offering your son a chance to grow up, even if not in the way you originally planned. Consider the alternative, watching him fade away over the next few hours, holding his lifeless body as winter claims what little warmth remains in his flesh. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on her. Save Thomas by damning herself and potentially countless other children, or watch him die knowing she had the power to prevent it. The entity had found the perfect trap, a mother's love turned against itself. From somewhere far above, she heard a sound that made her decision for her, Thomas crying, but not the weak, listless sound she had grown accustomed to. This was the strong, demanding cry of a healthy baby, the kind of cry that could wake parents from the deepest sleep and send them running to provide comfort. "You're right," Margaret said, opening her eyes and looking directly at the thing wearing her husband's face. "I can't destroy you without destroying Thomas." The entity smiled with Edmund's features, an expression of triumph that looked wrong on his familiar face. "But I can give you something else to feed on," Margaret continued, and before the thing could react, she drew the knife across her own throat. Blood poured from the wound, but instead of falling to the cavern floor, it flowed upward, drawn by some impossible force toward the heart tree. Where Margaret's blood touched the entity's flesh, the phosphorescent glow began to dim and the pulsing rhythm started to slow. "What are you doing?" the thing screamed with Edmund's voice, but now there was panic beneath the anger. "Poisoning you," Margaret gasped, her vision beginning to blur as her life drained away. "My blood carries every ounce of rage and grief and mother's love that I possess. Catherine was wrong about the ritual, it doesn't require fire or destruction. It requires something you can't understand, something you've never been able to consume. It requires willing sacrifice made not from despair but from pure, untainted love." The entity wearing Edmund's form lunged toward her, but it was too late. Margaret's blood had reached the core of the heart tree, and where it touched, the ancient flesh began to wither and blacken. The network of glowing roots that spread throughout the house started to convulse and writhe, their light flickering like dying stars. Margaret felt herself falling, her strength leaving her with each heartbeat, but she could hear Thomas crying above with the voice of a healthy child, and she knew that her sacrifice had worked. The entity's hold on her son was breaking, its stolen power flowing back to where it belonged. As darkness closed around her vision, Margaret saw the ghostly mothers materializing around the dying heart tree, their faces no longer twisted with grief but peaceful, finally able to rest. Catherine Lowen stood among them, and she smiled at Margaret with an expression of profound gratitude. "Well done, child," Catherine whispered. "Well done." Margaret's last thought before the darkness claimed her was of Thomas, alive and strong and free, growing up in a world where the Lowen House could never again reach hungry tendrils toward innocent children. Would you try to destroy the heart and risk everything, or flee and hope you could outrun an ancient curse? The silence that followed Margaret's sacrifice was absolute, a quiet so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing moved in the cavern beneath the Lowen House. Then, like a dam bursting, the entity's death scream tore through the air with such force that the very foundations of the house above began to crack and shift. Edmund, the real Edmund, suddenly freed from the thing's influence, stumbled down the basement stairs calling Margaret's name, his voice hoarse with confusion and terror. He had awakened to find their bed empty and the house shaking around him, filled with sounds like breaking glass and splintering wood. Above his head, Thomas was crying with lungs that seemed miraculous in their strength, but Margaret was nowhere to be found. The passage to the deep cavern had collapsed, sealing Margaret's body and the withered remains of the heart tree beneath tons of earth and stone. Edmund dug with his bare hands until his fingers bled, screaming his wife's name into the rubble, but he could not reach her. The sacrifice she had made was complete and irreversible. She had traded her life not just for Thomas's survival, but for the destruction of something that had plagued the mountain community for over a century. As dawn broke over the mountains, Edmund carried his son from the Lowen House for the last time. Behind them, the building groaned and settled as its supernatural foundation finally gave way. Windows cracked in perfect spirals, wallpaper peeled away in long strips, and the portraits of dead children fell from their frames to shatter on the floor. By noon, the roof had partially collapsed, and by evening, the place was uninhabitable. The townspeople came to gawk at the destruction, but Mrs. Hawthorne from the records office was the only one who understood what had really happened. She found Edmund sitting by the road with Thomas in his arms, staring at the ruined house with eyes that had seen too much. "She did it, didn't she?" Mrs. Hawthorne asked quietly. "She broke the curse." Edmund nodded, unable to speak past the grief that filled his throat like broken glass. Thomas gurgled happily in his arms, his cheeks pink with health, his eyes bright and alert in a way they hadn't been since they first crossed the threshold of the cursed house. "What will you do now?" the old woman asked. "I don't know," Edmund replied honestly. "Margaret, she left me a letter. Said if anything happened to her, I should take Thomas far from here. Start over somewhere that doesn't know about curses and hungry things that feed on children." Mrs. Hawthorne nodded approvingly. "That's wise advice. This place has seen enough tragedy." Edmund spent one last night in the town's boarding house, holding Thomas close and trying to make sense of the fragments of memory that came back to him in pieces. He remembered Margaret's growing fear, her research into the house's history, her desperate attempts to convince him that something was wrong. But he also remembered stretches of time that felt like dreams, periods when his thoughts had not felt like his own, when he had argued against leaving the house with a passion that seemed to come from somewhere outside himself. The entity had been inside his mind, he realized. It had used his voice to argue against Margaret's fears, had made him dismiss her concerns as hysteria, had kept him docile and compliant while it slowly drained their son's life force. The knowledge filled him with a guilt so profound it threatened to crush him, but Thomas's healthy cries pulled him back from the edge of despair. Margaret had saved their son, and he would honor her sacrifice by raising the boy to be strong and good and free from the shadows that had haunted the Lowen House. 3 days later, Edmund loaded their few remaining possessions into a wagon and left North Carolina forever. He never spoke publicly about what had happened in the house, but he made sure the story was recorded in the town records, along with a warning that the land should never be built upon again. Years passed. Edmund remarried eventually, a kind woman named Sarah who loved Thomas as if he were her own son and never asked too many questions about the haunted look that sometimes crossed Edmund's face on winter nights. They moved to Ohio, where Edmund found work as a carpenter and Thomas grew up strong and healthy, with no memory of the house that had nearly claimed his life. But some scars run deeper than memory, and as Thomas grew older, certain things became clear. He never slept well in absolute darkness, always needing a candle or lantern burning nearby. He was uncomfortable in old houses, especially those with basements, and he showed an unusual sensitivity to places where tragedy had occurred. Animals trusted him instinctively, as if they could sense that he had been touched by something otherworldly and emerged unblemished. Most tellingly, Thomas grew up with an inexplicable knowledge of things he had never been taught. He could sense when children were in danger, could identify adults who meant harm to young ones, and seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of the hidden darkness that sometimes lurked behind respectable facades. It was as if his brush with the entity beneath the Lowen House had left him with a kind of protective instinct, a guardian's awareness that would serve him well throughout his life. Edmund never told Thomas the full truth about his mother's death, only that she had died saving his life and that she had been the bravest woman who ever lived. But on Thomas's 18th birthday, he gave his son a letter that Margaret had written during those final weeks in the cursed house, a letter that explained everything she had discovered, everything she had sacrificed, and everything she hoped for her son's future. "You were worth every drop of blood, every moment of pain," Margaret had written in her careful script. "You were worth trading my life for yours, worth facing the darkness so that you could grow up in the light. Live well, my darling boy. Live freely. And if you ever encounter something like what we faced in that house, remember that love is stronger than any curse, and that a mother's sacrifice can break chains that have bound evil for centuries. Thomas read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and placing it in his pocket, where he would carry it for the rest of his life. That night, he dreamed of a woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, a woman who sang lullabies that made him feel safe and loved. When he woke, he knew with absolute certainty that somewhere beyond the reach of earthly troubles, his mother was at peace. The Lowen House stood empty for 10 years after Margaret's sacrifice, slowly crumbling as weather and neglect took their toll. Eventually, the town council had it torn down completely, and the land was turned into a small park with a memorial garden. Local legend said that no flowers would grow there at first, as if the soil itself was poisoned by the decades of tragedy that had soaked into it. But gradually, as the years passed and Margaret's sacrifice purified the ground, wildflowers began to bloom in the spring. Children played in the park without fear, their laughter carrying on the mountain wind like a blessing. The curse was broken, the hungry thing that had fed on young lives was destroyed, and the mothers who had lost children to its appetite were finally able to rest. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light was just right, visitors to the park reported seeing a woman in a simple dress walking among the flowers, her face peaceful and her hands folded in prayer. She never spoke to anyone, never acknowledged the living world around her, but her presence was comforting rather than frightening, a reminder that love could triumph over the darkest evil, and that some sacrifices echo through eternity as blessings rather than tragedies. Margaret Whitmore had paid the ultimate price to save her son and break a curse that had claimed countless young lives. But in death, she had found something that had eluded her in life, the certainty that her sacrifice had meaning, that her love had been stronger than ancient evil, and that Thomas would grow up free from the shadows that had nearly claimed him. The house was gone, the entity was destroyed, and the children of the mountain community could sleep safely in their beds, protected by the love of a mother who had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. 23 years had passed since the night Margaret Whitmore sacrificed her life to destroy the entity that had plagued the Lowen House for over a century. The memorial park that now occupied the cursed land bloomed with wildflowers each spring, and children played there without fear, their laughter carrying on the mountain wind like a promise that some victories endure. Thomas Whitmore had grown into a man who carried his mother's strength in his steady hands and his father's quiet wisdom in his careful words. He had become a doctor, drawn to healing in a way that seemed to spring from somewhere deeper than conscious choice. His patients trusted him instinctively, and he had developed a reputation for sensing illnesses that other physicians missed, for knowing when children were in danger from sources that couldn't be found in medical textbooks. He had married a teacher named Elizabeth, a woman with laugh lines around her eyes and a gift for making even the most troubled children feel safe in her classroom. They had 3 children of their own, Margaret, named for the grandmother she would never meet, and twin boys, Edmund and William. The family lived in a bright house with large windows and no dark corners, a place where shadows couldn't linger and warmth filled every room. But on this particular winter evening, as snow fell softly outside their windows and the children slept peacefully in their beds, Thomas sat in his study holding a newspaper clipping that had arrived in the morning mail. The letter that accompanied it was brief, written in the shaky handwriting of an elderly woman. Dr. Whitmore, the letter read, "I read about your mother's heroism in the town records when I was researching local history. I thought you should know that the evil she died to destroy may not have been as contained as we hoped." The enclosed article describes events in a town 100 miles south of here. The similarities are troubling. Perhaps someone with your unique understanding might be able to help. Respectfully, Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne. The newspaper article described a house in the town of Millfield where 3 families had lost children to mysterious wasting illnesses over the past decade. The children grew progressively weaker despite medical care, their vitality seeming to drain away until they simply stopped breathing in their sleep. Local doctors were baffled, but the article mentioned strange sounds in the walls, toys moving on their own, and children speaking to invisible playmates who told them stories about the hungry place under the house. Thomas folded the newspaper with hands that shook slightly, remembering the letter his mother had left him, the warnings about things that could survive beyond their apparent destruction. He had hoped that Margaret's sacrifice had ended the threat completely, but what if the entity beneath the Lowen House had been only one manifestation of something larger? What if there were other hungry places, other houses where ancient evil had taken root? Elizabeth found him there an hour later, staring into the fire with the expression she had learned to recognize over their years of marriage, the look he wore when his unusual sensitivity picked up traces of something that didn't belong in the natural world. "What is it?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. Thomas handed her the newspaper article and watched her face grow pale as she read. Elizabeth knew the story of his mother's sacrifice, knew about the abilities that had somehow been passed down to him as a result of his brief contact with supernatural forces. She had seen him identify abusive teachers before they could harm her students, had watched him diagnose illnesses that other doctors missed, had witnessed the way animals and children gravitated toward him as if sensing a protective presence. "You're thinking about going to help them," Elizabeth said. It wasn't a question. "How can I not?" Thomas replied quietly. "If there's even a chance that what happened to my mother's family is happening to others, if there are more children dying while their parents feel helpless, I have to try." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, studying her husband's face in the firelight. She had known when she married him that his past would always be part of their present, that the sacrifice his mother had made would cast both shadows and light across their lives together. "We'll go together," she said finally. "All of us. If there are children in danger, they'll need more than just medical care. They'll need to know that someone understands, that someone believes their parents' fears." Thomas reached for her hand, feeling the familiar surge of gratitude that had filled him every day since he met her. Elizabeth had never questioned the strange stories about his childhood, never doubted his unusual abilities, never asked him to pretend that the world was simpler than they both knew it to be. "It could be dangerous," he warned. "If this is what I think it is, if there really is something like what lived under the Lowen House, then we'll face it together," Elizabeth replied firmly. "Your mother faced it alone, with only her love for you to sustain her. But you won't be alone. You have a family now, people who love you and believe in what you're trying to do." As if summoned by their conversation, young Margaret appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. At 8 years old, she already showed signs of inheriting her father's sensitivity. She had nightmares about places she'd never seen, could sense when other children were afraid, and had an uncanny ability to know when adults were lying. "Papa," she said, patting across the room in her bare feet. "I had the dream again. About the sad children in the dark house." Thomas lifted his daughter onto his lap, feeling his heart clench with a familiar mixture of love and fear. Margaret had been having dreams about trapped children for months now, dreams that seemed to grow more vivid and detailed with each passing week. He had hoped they were just normal childhood nightmares, but the newspaper article made him wonder if his daughter was somehow sensing the same supernatural disturbance that had drawn Mrs. Hawthorne's attention. "Tell me about the dream," he said gently. "There's a house with dark windows, and children inside who can't get out," Margaret said in the matter-of-fact tone that children used for even the most extraordinary things. "They're getting smaller and smaller, like they're fading away. And there's something underneath the house that's eating their light." Thomas exchanged a look with Elizabeth over their daughter's head. Margaret had never been told the details of what had happened to her grandmother, had never heard about entities that fed on children's life force, yet her dreams seemed to describe exactly that scenario. "The children in your dream," Thomas said carefully, "do they say anything to you?" Margaret nodded solemnly. "They say their mamas and papas can't see what's making them sick. They say they need someone who knows about the hungry dark to come help them." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind outside their windows. His daughter's dreams weren't just nightmares, they were a call for help, a psychic SOS from children who were trapped in the same kind of supernatural trap that had nearly claimed his own life decades ago. "We're going to help them," he told Margaret, making the decision even as he spoke. We're going to take a trip to see if we can find the children from your dreams." Margaret smiled for the first time since entering the room, a bright expression that reminded Thomas powerfully of the woman whose name she carried. "Grandmama will help us," she said with the confidence of a child who had never learned to doubt the impossible. "She told me so in my dream. She said the hungry dark can't win when families fight it together." Thomas hugged his daughter close, feeling the weight of inheritance settling around his shoulders like a cloak. His mother had fought alone and won, breaking a curse that had claimed generations of children, but the victory had cost her everything. Now it seemed that the battle wasn't over, that somewhere else children were dying while their parents felt helpless against an enemy they couldn't see or understand. But this time would be different. This time, the fight would be waged not by a desperate mother facing the darkness alone, but by a family united by love and strengthened by the knowledge that evil could be defeated. Thomas carried his mother's sacrifice in his heart, Elizabeth brought her fierce protection of children, and Margaret possessed a sensitivity that might prove crucial in identifying and confronting whatever was threatening the families in Millfield. As snow continued to fall outside their warm, safe house, Thomas began making plans for a journey that would either save innocent lives or expose his own family to dangers beyond imagination. But he felt no fear, only a quiet determination that seemed to echo his mother's voice from across the years. Margaret Whitmore had faced the hungry darkness and emerged victorious, trading her life for her son's future and the safety of countless other children. Now that future had arrived, and Thomas would honor her sacrifice by ensuring that no family would ever again face such horrors alone. The battle against ancient evil would continue, but this time it would be fought by those who remembered that love was stronger than any curse, and that some legacies were worth the price they demanded. If this story stayed with you, comment, "Some houses should stay empty."